This episode is dedicated to High Style Lifestyle, Layla Mickelson, Chris Barnes, and Blayberg Chacoma, for becoming our newest Southpaw supporters, and helping to make this project possible.
The Southpaw podcast and project is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you want to support the work that we do, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. Share these episodes, follow us on social media. If you're a new listener, make sure to click subscribe. And if you really want to support this project, then become a paid monthly subscriber on patreon.com/southpawpod. If you head over to Patreon and subscribe for just $4 a month, you will get immediate access to our complete catalog of bonus episodes, videos, and articles. The more supporters we have, the more time we can dedicate to the show, which means more bonuses, such as classic fight commentary, transcripts of interviews, building a Liberation Martial Arts online curriculum, and most important of all, hire and pay for staff. If you can't support us monthly, you can also do one-time donations at ko-fi.com/southpawpod. We also have t-shirts and sweatshirts to not only flex the show, but your own moral compass. By supporting us, you're not only helping us grow, you're also helping us stay and keep this project running. We can't exist without your support. Thank you.
This is Sam.
This is Ryan.
And this is Fight Study.
On this Fight Study, we have someone many of the listeners have been requesting, journalist and boxing writer, Ryan Songalia. Welcome to the show, Ryan.
Sam, thank you very much for having me on. It's really, truly an honor. I'm a big fan, and I'm really appreciative of all the work that you do.
Thank you for saying that. So before we get into any specific fight talk, let's get to know you better. How did you start as a journalist and reporter?
Actually, the way I started was I was a message board troll at this one boxing forum. And so I got banned a bunch of times. And so, this is the real story. I would send in these little, kind of what I, the best that I could approximate a boxing news story. I would have someone post it for me in the message boards under my real name while I was banned, right? So I could still have a presence in the message board. And I think the owner of the site, which is one of the biggest boxing news sites in the world now, he saw my stuff and he was just yeah, I'm going to actually offer Ryan a job. So yeah, I was 19 years old. I was basically I was about to drop out of college at that point because I wasn't feeling it so much. And I said, all right, I think I'm just going to do this boxing writing thing. And it was almost like boxing writer, cosplay for me for a while. I was faking it till I made it for real. I don't think anyone realized A, how young I was, or B, that I was living in a 1-room shack, on my own. And I really had nothing going on for me other than I was starting out to become a boxing writer, but I always had a passion for it. Boxing very much so saved my life when I was a teenager and I was going through a lot of problems. I was a juvenile delinquent and, I was in and out of juvenile detention and group homes, and boxing sort of gave me direction in my life, and writing had always been there ever since I was a kid. It was the one thing, writing and reading were the two things I had going for me as a kid. And I sort of combined those two, and yeah, it's been 15 years now. I've been a boxing writer.
So did you do this kind of backwards where you were a writer first and then you went to school to learn about writing and journalism?
Yeah, actually, I didn't even want to, I should probably rephrase that. I wasn't planning to go to graduate school. But I said, why not? Let's give it a try. And I kind of entered when I signed up to go to, the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, CUNY grad school. I was kind of, I was cautiously optimistic because I don't have an undergrad degree. I dropped out of college there, and then I went back a few years later, and then I dropped out again when I was, I think, like 23 or 24, because I got a gig at the Daily News, writing about the Golden Gloves, which was funny because I was sort of like, quote unquote, the pro, and then they had an intern who took half of the other Golden Glove dates, and the intern was the same age as me. You know what I mean? So it was kind of strange. Like I was sort of like teaching this intern, I think he went to like Northern Michigan or Michigan State or something like that. And I was teaching him like some of the tricks of the trade, but he was the same age as me, but I had like 5 years of experience at that point. So yeah, I did it backwards, and I was only the second person, I think, that was admitted to that school without an undergrad degree. The reason why is, I had like a lot of experience at that point, but I also had sort of like outstanding circumstances regarding, I had been in the Philippines for 4 years working at a news outlet called Rappler. And then I had to leave because of, threats against press freedom. And some of those threats were more than just against press freedom. You know what I mean? So yeah, that's sort of why I had to leave the Philippines. That's exclusive. I've never told that anywhere publicly, but yeah, that's sort of how I got into grad school, and I finished in December with my master's.
So do you feel like grad school helped you at all as a journalist and writer?
Yeah, I would say, because it taught me like a few other things, like how to do Premiere, how to edit and write like news packages, like for TV and radio. But more so than that, it got me out of my comfort zone, because, the first few stories I tried to pitch to, like, my first class were like boxing stories, because I felt comfortable there. But like, no, we want you to do like reporting like outside of boxing, which I can do, but it takes a little work. I could write a boxing story in my sleep. But writing about, say, like, a primary election, and what the agendas are, things like that, and changes to, like, alternate side parking, whatever that is, that takes a little bit of thought for me. So yeah, but also I met some amazing people at school, and I got to collaborate with other people, and and I got to sort of stamp myself as more than just a boxing reporter, even though like that's always been my main forte. But I've done other stuff besides that.
Is writing sort of like acting where you can get typecast, or is it easier to write about more than one topic? Like, you became known as a boxing writer, but is it pretty easy then to break out of that and write about other topics? Or do you find some resistance where people are like, I don't know if I want you to write about this other thing because you're a boxing guy?
What's funny is that used to be the case for me. Like, I would pitch stories like to outlets, so, like, about real stuff, and they're like, yeah, that's nice, but I want to talk about your boxing stories. I'm like, wait, I have this idea here about, like, an election thing going on, and there's this important issue. No, yeah, but what about the next Pacquiao? So that was sort of the issue before, but the irony now is that I probably write more about non-boxing stuff. I've done a lot of work for a news outlet in Queens called Queens Post, where I write about, alternate side parking and those kinds of things. Changes to like a bridge or something. There's a fire in Woodside. That sort of stuff. More than and actually Vice, believe it or not, Vice. They knew about my boxing reporting, and lately I've done a lot of boxing writing for Vice. But when I interned there in the summer of 2020, I was when Black Lives Matter, was really the headline. I got to cover like the Black Lives Matter protests in Queens, which were not getting as much attention as, say, the ones in Brooklyn and Manhattan, and so I got to go to some of the more like conservative, like really right wing areas of the outer borough, places like Bayside and Middle Village, where those are Trump country, and sort of write about the people who were leading the Black Lives Matter movement in those areas. So I've done a lot of stuff outside of boxing, but my heart will always be boxing. That shaped me as a child, and kind of gave me a different perspective about life, and it really speaks to who I am as, like, just a small town kid from Cliffside Park, New Jersey. Grew up working class, and sort of like the interests. I may be out here or there. I may have traveled around the world, but I'm really just a working class proletariat guy with proletariat interests.
So you said it used to be that you were typecast. So was it grad school then that you think opened up more doors to allow you to write about other things and be kind of like a beat reporter? Or do you think it was basically legacy newspapers collapsing and they just needed freelance writers to cover all sorts of topics?
Probably a little both actually, because I think when all of like the old time like writers who really knew their beats sort of like took buyouts, like all right, fine, let's give the boxing guy a chance. Yeah, he could write about whether or not they're gonna build the bridge or something.
So what is it like being a boxing writer and freelance journalist? Is it constantly hustling for writing gigs?
Yeah, it is. It's I think there's this for some people who grew up watching movies like Almost Famous, like movies about journalism, even like stuff like Spotlight, that are a little bit more recent. Like it's not. It may look like glamorous, important work, and and it is important. I think because you're dealing with some of the most vulnerable workers that we're talking about, like a workers movement. There's nothing more vulnerable than like you get punched in the head for money. You're selling your brain cells in essence. It is important work, but it's not glamorous. A lot of times it's you're sitting in front of a laptop, and there were times when I was 19, 20 years old, and I was getting invited out to like parties, and I couldn't go because I had to write, about like Arturo Gotti's, farewell fight or something like that. You know what I mean? Or I had to, interview like some guy who's, trying to fight in the Olympics. It was, there was a lot of sacrifice involved, but it's fun. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I got to go to cover a lot of Pacquiao fights, and I'll tell you a funny story. Like, I don't get like starstruck when I see Pacquiao anymore because I've been around him so many times. But like, my dad is a huge Pacquiao fan. I'm Filipino. My dad is born and raised in Leyte, Philippines, and I remember when he went over. Pacquiao, I think, was getting ready. I want to say for like I forget who he was fighting. It was in 2018. Oh no, it was 2017. And my dad, like, was like, yeah, it's nice to see you, Ryan. We're in the Philippines. And then like, we're like, hey, you want to go stop by the gym and see Pacquiao? So we waited for a couple hours, and like my dad was so happy. I'd never seen my dad smile like that. Not even like when I graduated. Like, yes, that's nice. You graduated. Oh, Manny Pacquiao, get out of here. Take my photo. So like that was kind of cool to do that for my dad. I have a rule. I don't care what a boxer or anyone says to me. Like, like people tell me to fuck myself all the time. It's cool. But like I always say, like fight week at a top ranked show doesn't start until Bob Arum tells me to fuck myself. But but if as long as you're cool to my family, I don't, you're good in my book.
Now, can you get a job where you could spend some time on a story, like really dive in and prepare something long form, or is that few and far between?
I'm very thankful. I've been at the Ring magazine now since my 10th year, and they've allowed me to do that, where I can kind of pick my subjects, and they sort of trust me to know what a story is. And I got like an honorable mention. I got robbed. I should have won the first prize. But I got an honorable mention for one story I wrote, I think in 2015, about this. Just looking at a ring death from the perspective of the fighter, who survives, and how they deal with it, and what the and just contrasting these two very different people, like this one Filipino fighter from the province who has no choice but to fight, and then this other guy from Australia who's about to graduate law school, didn't really have to fight, but he liked it, he loved it. They that's not like a big name story, but if you put some work into it, you can really tell a compelling story. And I thought I did okay with that one. But a lot of times, like I like to go deep dive into like Filipino boxing, which is sort of when you talk about Filipino sports and Filipino culture, it's sort of insular. It doesn't really get out outside of America, outside the Philippines. Like even when people are talking about Pacquiao or they're talking about the big name fighters, the Americans don't get it. They really don't. They've never, I don't think, taken the time to understand how different the culture is we get this Americanized version of, a Filipino story. So like when people talk about Pacquiao running for president, they never talk about Pacquiao. Like, oh, Pacquiao could be the president. Yeah, they don't talk about Pacquiao being like fifth or sixth in the polls, like, or how difficult it would be for a first-term senator who, doesn't come, Manny has money like from fighting, but doesn't come from like, a dynasty family, to then put together a coalition, and establish the infrastructure needed to win, not just Mindanao, but also then win, Visayas and Luzon. You don't see that sort of stuff. Like, so I don't think the Americans really get it. So I get to kind of go into that. Like my experience, I lived in the Philippines for a number of years, as an adult, and I covered the Philippine boxing scene. Like, Gerwin Ancajas, who was he's the IBF junior bantamweight champion. He became like, kind of like the talk of the town, like in 2017, 2018 when he became world champion. But I was covering him like 2012. Like, he was training at the same gym I was training at, and I was like, oh, this guy's pretty good. Like, let me write about him and kind of get his story. And Donnie Nietes, he was a guy who, like, I think fourth division world champion. I think only him, Pacquiao, Donaire had ever done that in the Philippines. And he's a guy who's only caught on recently, but he's been a champion for like 10 years. But I was able to write about him over there and sort of understand, and not just looking at the story from like the perspective of like poverty porn, but really how this is a systemic thing in the Philippines, and how this poverty to boxing pipeline works. Those are the kind of stories that I don't think a lot of other people get right. That's sort of what I'm doing.
So even though it's a poor country, would you say the training level in the Philippines for boxing is very high?
In some regards, sure. Like, I think that the number one thing, is that there's a culture of it. It's an acceptance. People understand that, okay, boxing is this very vital thing that, you could fight your way literally out of poverty. They've seen other fighters do it, like Pacquiao. Before that, Flash Lorde, his family, is still doing well. About 30, 40 years after his death, based off of the work that he did in the ring. I think that there are some issues in terms of ring generalship that aren't really highlighted the way that they should be. Like cutting off the ring. If you look at fighters like Pacquiao, and last night, forget about it, John Casimiro. Like, yeah, he beat Guillermo Rigondeaux, but basically because Rigondeaux, decided, hey, I'm gonna move around and not really try to throw punches and win the fight. I think if John Casimiro was able to step over to his left, and when Rigondeaux was going out to his right, and throw a double left hook, head and body, yeah, he probably would have stopped him, at some point in that fight, because Rigondeaux had nothing offensively. But otherwise, if you look at, the great boxers with great jabs, and I think, the jab is, underutilized, not just in the Philippines, but, in boxing in general. Like, I think Roy Jones was the guy who kind of said, you don't really need a jab if you're fast enough. Yeah, but you know what? You're only that fast for about 5 years of your life. And then you have to kind of be immortal. And, if you throw power punches without a jab, you're going to get cracked in the mouth. So, like, I think that, Donnie Nietes and Gerwin Ancajas are fighters with great jabs. But, you don't see a whole lot of other guys that are, throwing great jabs like that and setting up their boxing. So I think there is some room for improvement. But I think that when, Pacquiao kind of opened up and let me give credit, Jerry Peñalosa, former world champion of a few years, like actually a couple decades ago, had an amazing jab. So otherwise, I think that there's some room for improvement. I think you're going to see more of an Americanization of Filipino fighters as more of them come to America. The way that you see with like Mexican fighters, like I couldn't believe when like guys like Marco Antonio Barrera and Juan Manuel Marquez were like, pretty like solid counterpunchers, as opposed to like back in like the 70s and 80s, and you saw like all these like all out Mexican brawlers. That's not the way it is anymore. There's this melting of like the styles that makes for more dynamic and versatile fighters.
So do you ever get a break, or is it 24/7 in boxing?
Oh, I never get a break. I mean, I get a break where I can, like but you have to, because I remember when I first came to Ring Magazine, I was on fire. I was just like, listen, I got a point to prove. We're going to be number one. I'm going to show these people, and we're going to take this over. And then, after a few years, I'm like, okay, like I have to find a way to live a meaningful and productive life outside of being a writer, and let me pick my stories a little bit better, and instead of just chasing because writing in general is a drug. I don't care what anyone says. It's crack. To me, it's crack. Not that but for me, it's like I write a story and I publish it, and then I get a high. And I'm like, oh, I did something cool. But then that high only lasts so long. And then you're like, oh man, like the buzz wore off. I need to go. You're chasing that high constantly. So yeah, I that's sort of how it is for me. I don't know for other people, but there's no there's no greater addiction to me than writing. And if I'm not writing, I'm not a happy person.
So it sounds like you like that type of constantly writing a lot of volume instead of not writing anything and just working on one book, let's say.
I mean, I wish I had the patience to work on a book. People say, "Right, I need to write a book." I had a few ideas for different stuff, and and when I did some long, I'll tell you, one of the writers that I mentored, straight out of college, this very talented basketball reporter by the name of Naveen Ganglani. He wrote a book, and I was just like, man, the writers that I'm mentoring, are writing books, but for me, it's like, I need that constant, all right, I did some good work and I'm publishing it. And now let me see what the fallout is. And let me see whose buttons I pushed, who's going to put me on a hit list this week. That sort of thing. Or even writing for the magazine, I write for the Ring magazine. It's hard for me to wait for that story to come out. And I want, hey, everyone go buy the magazine. I want everyone to read my stuff. I want, I want to be in the public domain. I want, sometimes being behind a paywall, even if it's just buy the magazine so we can continue publishing, that could be hard for me.
We've done a show talking about top boxing scandals with Matt Hunter, but recently we had another scandal with the WBA that might have made that list if we had done it now. Can you tell us what happened?
Well, first off, it's not so much what the WBA did. I mean, the WBA is itself a scandal. That it exists is proof of corruption, and just, this organization is just shamelessly, cartoonishly corrupt. You understand? If I always say that the greatest boxing documentary ever was The Great White Hype. I don't know if you saw that with Damon Wayans, and it's so over the top, but that's actually true. It's you know what I mean? It's so, the WBA is so on the nose that if you invented it for a movie, they would say, no one could be this corrupt. This is,
So you can't parody it.
No, you can't. We're going to talk about that. And I have 100 things that I hate about the WBA. I think, I think that they're everything that's wrong with boxing. I mean, the other sanctioning bodies, don't get me wrong, they're pretty bad too. The WBC, the WBO, had a recent thing where they tried to actually put a purse bid where the challenger, the mandatory challenger, will get more than the champion. Just all sorts of garbage that we see from these sanctioning bodies. But the WBA, in a corrupt and treacherous world, are uniquely horrible. So, I'm trying to compose myself because I'm so upset still about the whole thing that happened. Michael Fox got robbed so bad in a fight against Gabriel Maestre, right? So Maestre is a WBA connected fighter. He's from Venezuela, 2-time Olympian, and he got the ears boxed off of him by Michael Fox, who boxed the fight of his life. And then they robbed him, but they didn't just rob him. They robbed him by scores that were so wide so as to make it seem like he wasn't even competitive in the fight. So a boxing writer whom I respect, greatly, not just because he's my friend, Corey Erdman, he compiled a list of the racist tweets that one of the judges had written over the years. Her name is Gloria Martinez Rizzo. She's been suspended indefinitely, I believe, by the WBA, but they're gonna wait until this whole thing blows over, and then they'll sneak her back in. That's the way they always do it. But she was, not just MAGA, but like Proud Boys, kind of, like calling like Michelle Obama a monkey on Twitter, and just horribly racist and just tasteless messages. And then these tweets happen to be found at a time where she, flagrantly robbed a black fighter of a fight that he should have won, and by a score of 117-111, which was just not even in the realm of possibility. And the WBA, as shameless as they are, they're like, yeah, we're gonna issue a mandatory rematch because the fight was close. The fight wasn't close. What are you talking about, right? So, and then on top of that, just to show how much of a money grab this whole thing is. This is such a scandal. They charged the fighter $10,000 to file a protest. So it's just, there's just no class, no. And the thing is that the corruption of boxing isn't so much of a bug. It's like a feature now. Like, we've been conditioned to accept how bad boxing is, that it's, irredeemable, it cannot be rehabilitated, that it's just how it's going to be. And, we talk about since the beginning of boxing, there's always been sort of like these attempts to kind of control the outcomes, not like so much like the way that it's choreographed, like pro wrestling, but just in the sense of, okay, matchmaking, and I can look at the card and I can just tell from who's in what corner who's gonna win the fight. So it's so many times like people have I've seen people try to bet with me. I'm like, don't let me take your money. It's I already know what's gonna happen. There's very rare times when I'm surprised by an outcome. If you really know what you're looking at, you won't be surprised 99.999% of the time in boxing. But the WBA, people say, oh, we should, the American Association of Boxing, I forget what they call it, ABC, Association of Boxing Commissions, right, which is oversees the various commissions that control boxing in different states and territories. So we're threatening to not sanction the WBA. I'm like, when does the FBI file a RICO case? That's what I want to know. I've been saying this for years. Why? They took down Bob Lee, who was the founder of the IBF, in 2001. They sentenced him, I don't know, I think 2 years in prison, or a little bit less than 2 years in prison, for selling rankings, right? And it was pretty flagrant, but now they do that they just sanction a regional belt and say it's, oh yeah, and if you win this belt against your handpicked opponent, you're the top 5. That's selling a ranking. Boxing is so corrupt. I can't defend it.
Now, we just had the Olympics. Are there any boxers from this Olympics we should keep our eyes on?
Yeah, I think there are a number of them. And first off, I want to say that the IOC did the right thing by suspending AIBA, which I call the WBA of amateur boxing. Basically, the AIBA was suspended from overseeing Olympic boxing at this at the Tokyo Games because of they also are comically corrupt. I mean, you want to talk about corruption? AIBA had one of the most amazing scandals that kind of went on. It was a FIFA level scandal that no one cared about because it was boxing, right? So they installed this one guy as the head of AIBA, guy from Uzbekistan, Gafur Rakimov, who's accused of being a drug trafficker. Which no one, it kind of flew under the radar, but it was just yeah, boxing's so bad. But yeah, you know what? So what? There's a drug trafficker, like, organized crime leader running, Olympic boxing. But, they had so many terrible scandals throughout the years. 2012 and 2016 were, offensively bad, the judging. And, I remember there was one guy, I think he was running the 20, I want to say the 20, like, he was one of the main referees at the 2017 Southeast Asian Games that, like, he was like he was like a B movie bad guy in terms of like how corrupt he was as a referee. And I sort of wrote the stories of, like, the 5 worst robberies that this, or, injustices that this guy had overseen, and it was pretty bad. But yeah, back to the point of Olympic boxing. Who are the good fighters? And the reason why we could say that who are the good fighters, because the judging was a lot better without Aiba. But in 2021, I think that Jalalov, the Uzbek heavyweight, super heavyweight, who won the gold medal, very sharp southpaw heavyweight boxer promoted by Lou DiBella. I think he's based out of Brooklyn now. He's going to be a guy that he's going to be avoided in the pros because, he's a heavy-handed southpaw who can box, and he's tall. And until he gets with a big time, deal maker, no one's going to want to fight that guy. The middleweight, Yumir Marshall, who won bronze from the Philippines, I thought he had a real chance of winning gold. Something was off with his, in the semis, his stamina wasn't what it should have been. But in the professionals, I think that once he kind of gets an organized training camp, he's going to be a real, serious fighter to contend with. The other Filipino who won silver in flyweight, Carlo Paalam, he's going to be a real handful in the pros, very sharp, only 23 years old. The guy who beat him, Galal Yafai, out of Great Britain, he comes from a big boxing family. His brother, Cal Yafai, was a 2008 Olympian and was a IBF. No, was he IBF? No, he was a WBA. There we go. Junior bantamweight champion in the pros. Very, very talented fighter. And Gamal Yafai, his other brother, was a domestic champion. Otherwise, Duke Reagan, the American featherweight, and of course, Keyshawn Davis, the American lightweight. Those guys are going to be world champions in the professionals, I believe. And any of the Cubans, you take your pick. Any of them turn pro, they're going to dominate the sport for the next decade. So, but that takes them, leaving Cuba so that they can pursue a professional boxing career. But like many others have done. I think Rigondeaux, it took him like 7 times trying to defect before he finally was able to come over. But yeah, you take any of the 4 gold medalists, and they're going to be a world champion in 5 fights.
And this person wasn't in the Olympics, but he's a young fighter. And I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about him, because a lot of the California locals always ask about him. And he's a boxer named Brandun Lee.
Oh, yeah.
How do you see his trajectory?
He's young. He's 22 years old, I think. Really good kid. Like, that's one thing that, like, people don't realize. Like, when you're talking about marketing a fighter, this is, a super smart, super bright young man, and I think he can really do some serious stuff. And he has, a very good, like, professional, amateur career at the national level. I remember just getting excited. Like, the most excited I'd been for a fight was when he fought Camilo Prieto, and he stopped that guy in 3 rounds. But that was like right when all of the pandemic started, and all the sporting events were shut down, and the only thing that was happening was like this one fight card on Showbox where there was no audience. They kept it going because they're like, yeah, we already booked the thing and we're on a reservation. We can kind of write our own rules. But like it was like the sporting world turns its eyes to Brandun Lee on this pretty much insignificant card. But it's he's got to step up. He knocked the guy out last night. Who hadn't won in his last 4 fights. I want to see him in a real fight, and I know that Brandun Lee can step up because he's fought everyone, in America, on the national level. So I think they're taking it slow with him because of his age, and they're hoping that he'll mature. But as 140, maybe even like as a lightweight, if he can still get down there. But definitely he'll be a future welterweight, and I think that he's a guy that you have to really keep your eye on because such an interesting personality and such, he's a heavy-handed puncher. Like he scores knockouts, and these are not like stop standing. He knocks people out cold. A lot of fun to watch. He's going to be a lot of fun to watch for years to come.
A note to our loyal listeners: if you love the show, please support us and help us get paid for our labor by joining Team Southpaw on Patreon. By becoming a member, you'll get access to bonus content like exclusive articles, fight previews, bonus episodes, transcripts of fight studies, and access to our private chat group on Discord. But more importantly, you will help us supplement the cost of the show, the incredible time and energy Sam and I put into making the show, and you'll be giving us some breathing room not only to juggle Southpaw with our day jobs, but also expand Southpaw into other areas. Show your Southpaw solidarity by supporting us at patreon.com/southpawpod.
Now on August 21st, Manny Pacquiao was supposed to fight Errol Spence. What happened to this fight?
Well, it just shows how boxing, I mean, you can't say anything. That's a real serious injury. And, I whenever we're talking about eye injuries, these are very serious. Israel Vasquez, who gave us so many entertaining wars throughout the years, he has a glass eye now. And, this is the price he's paid for all those wars that entertained us throughout the years. So many fighters are blind, from detached retinas that weren't properly healed. And, this is not as serious. It seems it was a torn retina that was caught by a doctor as part of a routine mandatory checkup. So I'm glad to hear that, Errol Spence's long-term health will not be jeopardized more so than, any boxing, is, jeopardizing your long-term health. So that said, boxing just has the worst luck, in terms of fights falling out over so many different issues, and Tyson Fury catching COVID and whatever. The boxing has bad luck. But he had a torn retina, not a detached retina. And he's out of the fight. And Yordenis Ugas, who was he was going to be in the co-main event, he is going to be fighting Manny Pacquiao now, which is, a great opportunity for him to make a lot of money. And this might be the last time we ever see Pacquiao because, if Pacquiao, I don't know if Pacquiao is going to win the presidency. I wouldn't favor him, but if he does get on a ticket and, he runs as the vice president, he might have a real shot, because the vice president and the president are elected separately in the Philippines. So that might be the last time we ever see Pacquiao, unless he wants to be like, the fighting, instead of the fighting senator, he'll be the fighting vice president or fighting president, I mean, I don't know the wisdom of an elected head of state getting punched in the face on pay-per-view, but whatever. He kind of makes his own rules in life. But this might be the last time we see Manny Pacquiao in the ring. And instead of it being Errol Spence, which is supposed to be like this epic, comic book level showdown.
Yeah.
We're gonna see him against, a guy, whose biggest win was losing to Sean Porter. And a fight that I thought he should have won. But whatever.
And where is Manny right now in his career?
I mean, he's 42 years old. Nothing makes me feel older than seeing Manny Pacquiao grazing his beard, because I grew up watching Manny Pacquiao. When he won his first fight in America in 2001, I grew up reading the Filipino newspapers, the Filipino Reporter, the Filipino Express, all the Filipino papers that, in America, right? The ethnic media, always loved Pacquiao, and they would also get the stories from the big newspapers in the Philippines and sort of write them, or they would run the stories from the Philippines. So I would hear about Pacquiao, but when he won the IBF 122-pound championship with such a significant upset victory over Lelo Honolo Laduaba, rest in peace. It was so big in America. I was in the Filipino community. I was 14 years old, and then when he beat Barrera, that was such a huge thing. Marco Antonio Barrero was like really like the heir to Julio Cesar Chavez, in terms of just like badass Mexican fighter who, amazing chin and guts and just, break your ribs. And, that was who Barrero was. And then Pacquiao went out there and beat him up. Not just like, stopped and knocked him out, but he beat him up. Like, that was unbelievable. And now I'm seeing Pacquiao with grays in his beard. I'm like, oh my goodness. Like, where's the time gone? So yeah, that's where he is in his career. This will probably be his last fight, I believe, like seriously, just because of his whole life over like the last 15 years or so, when he first, ran for Congress and, and then he became a senator. And now, looking at the 2022 election in the Philippines, his whole life has been building towards either being the president or the vice president. So if that happens, that should be the end. That should be the end. But who knows, Pacquiao.
But you think even at his age and his decline, it's still enough to be the favored fighter over Ugas?
Oh yeah, he's massively favored. And I even thought he had a real chance against Errol Spence, because Spence is right there. Like, Spence is not a guy you have to go find. He's not Floyd Mayweather, who can go out there and sort of box safely and pot shot you and grab you and, that sort of thing, and win rounds, a la like, Floyd or like late stage Bernard Hopkins. He's a guy who's right there. It's not a bad style for Pacquiao. And he's not, even though he has a very strong jab, he's not a physical guy. He's not going to rough up an older man. But Ugas, I don't think Ugas has the firepower to hold off someone like Pacquiao. Like, Pacquiao, even at this age, he's always going to be Pacquiao. So, he knows how to win fights, and I think Manny should have too much to beat Ugas. But it also depends. Like, there have been like people who speculate that Ugas may have known a little bit earlier, but I there's no way to know, and switched his training. No one can really know. So I've seen Bernard Hopkins suggest that in an interview, but it depends on how much experience Ugas has or how much preparation he's able to do against a southpaw. I think switching from a right-hand opponent to a southpaw, the way that Ugas is a lot harder than what Manny was doing, switching from southpaw to a right-hander, because Manny hadn't fought a southpaw in like a decade.
Are there other fights on this card that you think deserve some attention?
Mark Magsayo. I like Mark Magsayo. Really good kid. I mean, I think this would be an interesting fight. This could be a real shootout. Mark Magsayo, a featherweight undefeated guy, but has never really gotten to that point where you're like, okay, this is the next champion. He's fighting Julio Ceja, who's got a lot of power, is a brawler, and won't be hard to find for Magsayo. So if Magsayo is able to sort of get him in front of him and make that fight work, yeah, that could be a real barn burner. I thought that Mark Magsayo's fight, I was ringside for this fight. It was one of the most when it comes to, fight of the year, and the Boxing Writers Association of America, they only see the fights that are on like the big networks. I was at ringside when in 2016 when he had a 6-round like street fight with Chris Avalos that was one of the best fights I'd ever seen in person, and it got no attention as fight of the year, but that should have been. And and Mark's a great guy. His wife Frances, I go way back with them. I was at Mark's pro debut, and he's 22-0 now, and we'll see if he's going to be able to get to the next level. Otherwise, if you like, kind of like, like brawls between faded former champions, Victor Ortiz versus Robert Guerrero could be fun. Like, like just two guys who've seen better days, just kind of like throwing bombs at each other. It could be a good old man fight.
The week after the Pacquiao Ugas card, we have Jake Paul versus Tyron Woodley on August 29th for Showtime. Before we even talk about this fight, can you give us your thoughts on this renaissance of celebrity/exhibition boxing, as far as if you think this is good or bad for boxing?
Well, it's kind of a tough question to answer, because is it good for boxing? Jake Paul is a very smart guy, and his brother is too. They're both very smart. Yeah, because they, while exploiting boxing, they also point out how bad, boxing is at, highlighting some of its best talent. So Jake Paul, when the fight was announced with Tyron Woodley, he puts Amanda Serrano on the undercard and doesn't just say, oh, she's going to be fighting, you're going to see her. He actually promotes her. He does like a photo shoot with her, and Amanda Serrano, for what, she's one of the best female fighters who've ever lived. And yet boxing, because of, I believe, chauvinism, sexism, and just a lack of creativity, doesn't know how to promote its female talent the way that the UFC does, or even Bellator. That's why you see a lot of like the top female boxers have to moonlight, as MMA fighters, 'cause a lot of them, do come from like kickboxing and karate backgrounds, but like they have to go to these other forms of fighting because they don't get the respect and attention and the way that they should, because boxing is stuck in the 1960s.
It's kind of the opposite for men, right? The men in MMA try to go over to boxing because the pay is better. Whereas in women's boxing, because women's boxing is so, let's say, unpopular, they are looking at MMA.
Yeah, I would say it's a fair comparison, because with, boxing is like, free market capitalism on steroids. It's like, it's whatever you can get and however you can get it. That's the way it is. Whereas in, you kind of have like this almost like WWE style of like promotion, and like where you're under contract to like, the UFC or whatever, and they can control how much money you're going to make. And, you have no leverage because there is no other show in town. They are the show. And if you don't want to be there, okay, you sit on the sidelines for whatever, and you sit at home, you don't make a check. So it's really hard, I think, for UFC fighters and MMA fighters to get the leverage that boxers are, which is like, if a boxer is able to get out of a contract with promotion, and trust me, a lot of those boxing promotional contracts can be pretty like, one-sided. And if you, don't want to fight, they'll sideline you. And we saw guys like Andre Ward give up years of their career as a result. And, it was almost like for Andre Ward, it was almost like, not to compare the two situations because they were very different, but how Muhammad Ali lost like 3 years of his prime, because of his opposition to the Vietnam War, or boxing exhibitions for the U.S. Army. He took a stand, whereas and Andre Ward was fighting his promoter, and just wasn't going to do business with this guy, and finally was able to extricate himself towards the end, but it gave up a lot of years as a result. And he retired undefeated. We don't know what he would have done in those years. So yeah, no, it's boxing is it's the Wild West, and you have a limited number of years to make money, and if you can make money in those years, it's great. But you have so many of these very talented fighters who can be marketed, because I actually think that the women in boxing are in many ways more marketable, because they could they a lot of them have these very interesting backstories, and they're much more open than a lot of the men boxers are. A lot of the male boxers, they're a little bit hesitant to show some of their vulnerability, whereas that's not the case with a lot of the female boxers that I deal with. So I'm thinking about like someone like Heather Hardy, Clarissa Shields, a lot of these fighters, that you can do some things with them. Amanda Serrano. So Jake Paul identified that, and was like, yeah, you can say whatever you want about me, but here's Amanda Serrano, who boxing, didn't do shit for, and I'm putting her on the card. What have you done for, someone who's being overlooked, lately?
Do you cover these exhibition fights at all, or do you treat it as a novelty that's adjacent to the sport that you cover?
I mean, it's definitely adjacent to the sport. It's not like, it has nothing to do with, the actual, like, who's the best fighter. There's nothing relevant to actual boxing about it. But I do cover it because it is news. Like, so I was at the Mayweather Logan Paul fight, but I took it for what it was. This was, it was a clown show, sure, but there is why are people here? Why does anyone care about this? And I wanted to sort of talk about that and what are the things that people are getting excited about. Like what is it that brings the fight? The fight fans. They're not really fight fans. The people who follow Logan Paul and Jake Paul, they're fans of Logan Paul and Jake Paul, not boxing, and they'll never cross over. But why do people want to see these guys? And the best that I can understand, it's like they built this following through social media and YouTube, and I almost felt like I was being trolled because here I am. I drove down to Miami, and I took it as this is what it is. I'm here to have a good time. I wrote a story afterwards for Vice where I said, this is fucking stupid. Like, this is, what are we doing here? But I was being trolled because here I am at a press conference, and Logan Paul and reporters are asking Logan Paul, what are you going to do next? And, do you want to fight, Manny Pacquiao? Like, and it felt like I'm in a Key and Peele sketch. This is ridiculous. Like, I have a master's degree, like, what am I doing here? But, they're not dumb. They know what they're doing. And they're getting to live like boxing fantasy camp because of, whatever it is that they're able to do in terms of bringing people to, to a stadium. And it's, I don't want to deride them as just like 15-year-olds on Twitch. It's, yeah, a lot of them are, but, they are very good at persuading their parents to pay for tickets. So it's whatever. These guys are really intelligent, but they expose, the unspoken truth about boxing, which is that, it's all about matchmaking. There's a sleight of hand with boxing. Like, Jake Paul is fighting Tyron Woodley not to lose the fight, Like, you can say whatever you want about Tyron Woodley's, background as an MMA fighter. He's never been a boxer. So, yeah, they picked him because he's going to get knocked out, and Jake Paul's going to say, look, I destroyed this, whatever guy, like this MMA fighter, just like I did to whoever was the other guy he did. And I destroyed, Nate Robinson. Like, yeah, they're not boxers. I remember interviewing Nate Robinson before the fight. How much boxing experience do you have? A couple of weeks. Wait, what? Like, really? Oh, yeah, I back in the day, I used to be like, I put the gloves on my brothers in the backyard. Like, this is being sanctioned as a professional fight? Like, and then he went in there and didn't know how to box, and people were surprised. Oh, Nate Robinson's going to beat him up. Nate Robinson is, a basketball player. If they played basketball, Nate Robinson would probably destroy Jake Paul. Like I could say, yeah, I beat Deontay Wilder in chess because that's all I do is play chess. Like, doesn't mean I would beat him in a boxing match in his actual sport. I think when you're talking about the Paul brothers, and this is not to deride them or accuse them of anything, but you're talking about like this level of privilege that boxers, the people who, they started from like, the lowest levels of like amateur boxing and then fought their way to become like national champions and then turn professional. They can't write their ticket the way that the Paul brothers can. Like, the Paul brothers are huge, physically huge guys. And if you take them for who they are in terms of athletes, they are real physical specimens. Like, they're legit solid 200-pound, 190-pound guys. But we just saw Jake Paul released a video talking about Gervonta Davis is on my hit list. I'm going to beat Gervonta Davis. Gervonta Davis fights at lightweight, 100 or 140 pounds even, I think. And the Paul brothers are like 190, 200 pounds. On what planet is that like, I'm going to beat a guy 60 pounds lighter, and that's going to be something cool. It's ridiculous. there are weight classes. They're kind of bullies, right? But they can get away with it because their fans don't understand boxing, and they don't understand that. Oh yeah, no, there are weight classes for a reason. Like if Logan Paul was the same size as Floyd Mayweather, Floyd would have knocked him out. The way that he did with Conor McGregor. And then Jake Paul at the press conference, he's like, "Oh yeah, you hurt Floyd like Maidana and like I forgot who else he said hurt him. And Shane Mosley." And not even Logan Paul was comfortable trying to run with that because of how ridiculous it was. But they're good at like framing stuff as, real, right? It's, it's really a clown show. And it speaks to their privilege that they're able to do all this stuff. And, no one, no one looks at what's actually going on and say, "Hey, we need to stop this. This is ridiculous. This is diminishing what it means to be an actual, professional boxer."
In this type of arena, against the type of competition that he's facing, right? Which is mostly people who've made their names in other things. Like, how good is Jake Paul? Is he like a good club boxer, or how would you rate him relatively?
I mean, we won't know until he fights Michael Phelps. So that's really the big challenge out there because, Jake Paul doesn't have an Olympic gold medal. I think that, what, looking at what he is, he could be a pretty good boxer. I don't think that he could. I mean, I don't know because I've never had to see him like actually go out there and box, but he's very strong. He knows how to punch. He's a puncher. He's a solid guy. I think he would have to pick a weight class. He's 175 or 200. You'd have to either cut down or fill in to 200 pounds. But I think that he's a guy that if he, you took him, he was a guy from like Ohio and you built him right, you could do something with him. Sure. But he would eventually get chinned. That's the way I see him because, just looking at, you can only be so strong for so long and then like, you don't move your head. But fighting Nate Robinson, a guy who had no business in a professional boxing ring, and I forget who the other guy was, the UFC guy.
Ben Askren.
Yeah, Ben Askren. I remember him from one championship. Everyone was telling me how great he was. I was falling asleep watching him. Like, I used to cover, MMA cards in the Philippines, and I saw him there. I was like, what is this? What am I watching? But yeah, no, the guy, Ben Askren, looked like he'd never seen a boxing match before. So, yeah, it was, it's hard to tell. He didn't pick Tyron Woodley because, Tyron Woodley is going to test his boxing skills. He's a guy with a name. He's going to, Woodley's going to do whatever he can with the limited experience he has in boxing and some athleticism. And then he's going to, take a nap. Like, Showtime is getting involved with these guys.
Yeah. It's not even Triller.
It's It's Showtime, which, had been the leader in boxing for a long time. But at the end of the day, that just shows you how boxing is free market capitalism on steroids. They're like, yeah, we'll do business with these guys. Sure. We'll even put on a women's fight, even though we don't care about women's boxing. But they'll make some money with this. And, because there's Woodley and people like to see a circus, and this is what it is. It's a circus. And, the boxing hardliners, the boxing hardcore, I like to consider myself sort of a progressive minded, classical boxing, observer. But at the same time, it's like I'm looking at this thing. I'm like, no, this has nothing to do with boxing. What are we doing here? When I was at ringside, and don't get me wrong, my nieces, they thought I was the coolest guy on the planet because I got to ask questions to Logan Paul. But what else are we doing here?
So do you think Tyron Woodley is coming into this fight kind of like Nate Robinson, where maybe he's not going to take it too seriously? He knows what he's going in there for, which is to lose to this guy. Not like they're intentionally going to throw the fight, but they know what's happening here. They know how the sausage is made, and they're just going in there for the payday.
I think he's taking it as seriously as he can. That said, what is his, his background? What's his, in terms of boxing? He was an amateur wrestling star. I I don't know. Like if there were takedowns in this fight, I would have to, make Woodley a favor, but there aren't. And he was a smaller guy. Like, he was fighting. First off, he's like 5'9", and like he was fighting at like 170. So this is more of the Paul brothers fighting smaller guys from other sports, because they are the cash cows, so to speak. They, so no, I think he'll try his best for sure, but he's not a boxer. There's only so much you can learn about boxing in a couple weeks. And I imagine I can't imagine him doing worse than Ben Askren, a guy who like didn't even know how to spell boxing. I don't think. And, like it was. I remember he was like favored at one point. The odds were pretty close, and someone was telling me at the Wild Card Gym, this guy doesn't know how to box. What is he doing? How this guy? Something's wrong with him. He can't box. So yeah, I don't think he'll be as bad as that, but yeah, he'll take a nap at some point in the fight, I think.
Speaking of MMA and boxing, what did you think of Anderson Silva as a boxer?
Well, Anderson Silva, people don't realize he had a boxing background.
Yeah.
He was a pro boxer, I believe, before he was in a pro MMA fighter. He wasn't like good or anything like that, but there were, he was like the striker of like, because all right, so back in the day, people used to talk about like how Chuck Liddell was this great striker, and then I would watch him and like, this guy doesn't know how to punch. But like Anderson Silva was a guy that knew how to throw punches in a correct way, and he had the sort of athleticism that I think would have lended itself to boxing. So he could have been a boxer. If he had a team behind him that knew how to get him to the next level, and he pursued boxing, he could have been a boxer. But I don't. How do I put it? Like, he fought a Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., who probably shouldn't be boxing anymore. He's abused his body in terms of just not taking care of himself, going up and down in weight, not training, and he's had some issues, outside of the ring, in his personal life. He was a spoiled rich kid. He's the son of a legend. And, yeah, if Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. was not Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. and was just like, I don't know, like some other guy, and had all the gifts he had, but none of the privilege, he would have been a great fighter. He would have been, instead he was handed a world championship by the WBC because the president of the WBC is like his godfather, right? So no, that's real talk. That's what they did. They gave Sergio Martinez a fake belt, they called him, I think, the Diamond Champion or something like that. And then they made the regular championship, the WBC, like the real, actual championship. They made it vacant, and he got to fight Sebastian Zbik, who was a guy who should never have been at a world championship level. He was handpicked because Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. He had the unique ability of being able to lose to Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., and that's why he was put in that situation. And then they didn't make the Martinez Chavez fight for a long time, and then Martinez eventually boxed the shit out of Chavez Jr. when they did fight, and which just shows that he was a fake champion. But yeah, the Chavez Jr. that Anderson Silva fought was a shadow of himself. He was, like Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. Should not be like reported on anymore. I think his fights, because I think he's lost so much of his. Like, he had lost to a guy named Mario Abel Cazares, and then he quit in his corner against Danny Jacobs. You know what I mean? Like, then Anderson Silva, hadn't fought a boxing match, and, I think since like the Clinton, years or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, that's sort of, he gets beat by him. I think, Chavez Jr. has been reduced to what he always was, which is a name, as someone who happened to, be related to a famous boxer who was beloved.
So you think it tells you more about Julio Chavez Jr. never lived up to his potential more than it does about how good Anderson Silva is transitioning to boxing?
Well, think of it this way. Like, Anderson Silva was, 10 pounds lighter than Julio Cesar Chavez, who had like 60, almost 60 pro fights or something like that. And Anderson Silva was able to win a split decision over him in a sport that, he entered a record of 1-1, So, yeah, I think that really just shows you more about Julio Cesar Chavez Jr., who, Even like I'll tell you, like there were moments in the Danny Jacobs fight where I thought, okay, he's being competitive. This could be good, and but he never took boxing seriously. Never had to because like he's sort of like the Tommy boy of boxing. Like remember when David Spade is like, just berating him, saying, "Oh, I'm Big Tom Callahan's son. I could be a big dumb animal, right? Like that's sort of what Chavez Jr. has always been like. Hey, I'm Chavez Jr. Don't you know who my dad is? And put me in a pay-per-view fight, and didn't respect the opportunity that he was given, and didn't respect the talent that he has. Like he got a lot further than Hector Camacho Jr. did. But Camacho Jr. was another guy, similar situation, had amazing ability. Like he could have been better than his father, but his father, came up hard and and knew how to fight, and there was a time where he took his career seriously and got something out of it. Hector Camacho Jr. never took his career seriously. If he had grown up the way his father did, without having like a famous father to fall back on, he could have been something great. Like I remember seeing him hit the speed bag, and it was like it wasn't even moving. He was so fast, and his reflexes, and um, even when he was an undefeated guy, you could tell he didn't take the sport seriously because he was letting guys stay in fights that they should have been gone in. He was more of a puncher than his dad, I think, had more speed and was bigger. So, in some ways, they're very similar. Like to get a only guy who was like the son of a champion and was able to really do something great was probably like Corey Spinks, and that's because Corey Spinks, didn't grow up in like with a lot of privilege. Corey Spinks, even though his father was Leon Spinks, Leon Spinks had a lot of problems in his life, and wasn't able to kind of give Corey Spinks a sheltered life. Corey Spinks came from St. Louis in a rough neighborhood and learned how to box, and didn't have his father like kind of micromanaging his career to make him fight like him. Like Corey Spinks' style was nothing like his father's style. So I think that also helped because you see like Joe Frazier trying to make Marvis Frazier box like him, even though Marvis Frazier is a tall guy who could box from the outside and was a really good boxer at the national level. But anyone who trained with Joe Frazier, be it Marvis Frazier or Burt Cooper, had to default to being Joe Frazier Jr. So yeah, it's not great for you to have a famous boxing father if you want to be a boxer. If you want to be a lawyer or something like that, yeah, they can afford pretty good tuition.
Now, are there any other fights on this Paul versus Woodley card that you think listeners ought to pay attention to?
I think definitely if you want to see boxers who are underrated, Amanda Serrano, hell yeah, she's a very exciting, hard punching fighter. And I'll tell you something about women's boxing. I didn't grow up as like this progressive minded person who's like, oh yeah, no, we need to pay attention to women's boxing. I was sort of like, I came from that, sort of boxing boys club mentality, like, in the gym, 99% of the people in the gym are men and, we're saying stupid things. And, I didn't really get into women's boxing until I got, the old, magazine editor was this guy named Mike Rosenthal, and he hits me up and says, hey, Ryan, you want to write about the women's we want to write the women's boxing comp for Ring Magazine? No, he said first, are you the guy who reached out to me and to take over the women's boxing column? I said no. He's like, oh, you want to do it anyways? Yeah, sure. Because I'm like 25 years old and I want to have a monthly column in Ring Magazine. Sure. And it turned out it was a mistaken identity. It was another person who had reached out, and I wound up getting the job. But before, and then I started talking to some of these female boxers, and I realized, oh my goodness, there's so much about them that people don't understand. They don't get it. That these are fighters who take the same risks as men. They're getting punched in the head, with gloves, and they're doing it for less pay. They have promoters who are not creative in promoting them, and they have to sort of sell tickets by themselves and go out there and be their own publicists because the people who run boxing have no idea what to do with them. And also, I have to credit Maureen Shea because when I first started covering boxing, I sort of over the years I became a lot more open-minded and progressive about things, and I remember going up to Maureen Shea telling her straight up, I don't like women's boxing, but you could fight, like you know how to box. Like I can appreciate a good boxer. And then just over the years, I kind of morphed into this person who like sees, the sacrifices and the exploitation of female boxers. And I've sort of become like this, like, and that's my beat. I in a lot of ways, I cover women's boxing. I see, very interesting stories, from them, and I appreciate their struggles and, just the struggles of, working people. When you talk about boxers, there's no, fighters more exploited and vulnerable than female boxers. Like every boxer, I don't care if you're Floyd Mayweather Jr., you're an underdog in life because you've had to go through so much to get to that point that you're like, you know what, I'm going to literally fight for my, I'm going to fight my way out of poverty. And when you go to female boxers, it's just so much more, so much more that they're underdogs because even world champions have to have day jobs. But yeah, wrestling undercard, yeah, probably Charles Conwell. He was a U.S. Olympian in 2016. I think he's a guy who's ready, in the next fight or two to fight for a world championship at 154 pounds. And, there's Tommy Fury. He's there. I guess so you can watch him. They're talking about him fighting, one of the Paul brothers. I don't know. We'll see. He's, I think, related. He's related to Tyson Fury. We'll see what else he has going for him besides that.
All right, Ryan. Appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. Where can people find you?
They can find me on the Ring Magazine, both the website ringtv.com and the monthly magazine. I write the Philippine boxing column. So if you like reading about just obscure Filipino 112-pound fighters, that's where you can read that every month. You could find me. I have a new daily boxing web show that's starting called Round by Round. That's Filipino boxing show. It launches on August 23rd, starring all like the top Filipino boxing analysts and reporters, Bill Velasco, Boyet Sison, those kind of very respected reporters in the Philippines. You can find me at 7-Eleven. I'm there a lot. I hang out there a lot. That's where you can find me. Yeah, you can find me all over the place. So yeah, Sam, I just really appreciate the opportunity to be on this podcast, and I just want to say that I really respect the work that you put out there. Your Twitter is like one of my favorite Twitter accounts. I often like share your tweets with some of my friends who are not even in combat sports because you just have like some really spicy hot takes. And I'm just like, wow, Sam really doesn't give a fuck, and I just I wish I could just be as just honest as you are about the world, like, but you have a very informed perspective on things, and you speak out on a lot of important issues in combat sports, including sexism, racism, things that I think need to be addressed. The ugly secrets of combat sports. A lot of the things that you talk about in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, I see them in boxing. So it's I see how there's so many similarities, that the struggles. I think that people who are open-minded and are looking around and realizing, hey, something's wrong here, that there are a lot of similarities in the two worlds that we occupy. So I just appreciate you kind of being that voice, and and just speaking up for things, including colonialism, that I touch on sometimes. But you really go in and you say the things that like a lot of times are on my mind, but I don't say them. So I appreciate you, kind of just going out there and just going ham.
Yeah, well, you got a job to consider, so I'm just a dude on the internet,
Yeah, sometimes it's good to be just a dude on the internet, because then you can just say things like, yeah, I know, but like I really respect the work that you do, and this podcast is very important, and I really hope that more people listen to it, because the perspective that you share is not. I mean, there are other like younger in boxing, especially like they're younger, progressive, voices, who kind of, it mirrors the, the demographic, shifts, splits that you see in society, in terms of their views. And some of us, we talk, but not, as openly, and, calling out some of the things and people in the industry. But we do, kind of, congregate, in DMs and things like that. And we talk about some of the things that are wrong with boxing. But like, you're out there as like a one person newsletter, like, hey, SOS, this is going on in BJJ and we need to address it. So I respect the hell out of you for that.
Oh, it means a lot coming from you, Ryan. Well, thank you. And I hope you will come back on the show sometime.
Anytime, Sam. Anything for you.
Now that's the show. If you enjoyed this episode and find this type of independent media worthwhile, please consider supporting the show on Patreon. We have a lot more episodes like this one in the works, but need your financial support to keep the show running. Even a few dollars a month goes a long way. No one does what we do, and it's all being funded by you, the listener. In return for supporting us, you'll gain access to lots of bonus content along with our private Discord chat. Even if you can't support us, there's a lot of free bonus content there as well. We also have an online store if you want to show your Southpaw solidarity by wearing our swag. You can find all pertinent links at southpawpod.com. And if you can't afford to support the show and still want to help, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen. This makes it easier for others to find us. And don't forget to share your favorite episodes or the podcast itself on social media. Tell your friends. Until next time, goodbye.
Southpaw. Hitting with the left. Southpaw. Sam. Paul. Southpaw. Southpaw.